I'm John Batchelor. Mary Kissel, my colleague, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, and the host of Opinion Journal is here. It's July 1991. The Henry Hudson Parkway runs along the west side of Manhattan, Upper Manhattan. There's Riverside Park. It's a very expensive, very exclusive place on the planet to live, quite privileged. On the roadside, you can come across detritus, things left out, and on this particular July, there was a cooler. When inside of the cooler was inspected, routine for NYPD, they found a dead little girl, 4 years old, no name. Her name, as I understand it, is now confirmed because of the work of NYPD's cold case squad. To help us tell this story, this is a very satisfying end to a tragedy, is Ed Hayes, my consigliere, my attorney, who's worked very closely with the NYPD for many years. Ed, a very good evening to you. The cold case squad, these are detectives. How do they work, and what are their ambitions? Good evening, Ed.
Well, in the first place, they're geniuses. They don't put you into the cold case squad unless you're a genius. And second of all, you have to have an intuition of how to find somebody that's paranormal. A normal person does not have the kind of... It's like some people can hit a baseball. Some people can hit 60 home runs in a year, and you don't know why. These guys can solve cases that nobody else can solve, and nobody knows why.
Eddie, this is a number of years later, though. How did they get this cold case revived?
What happened is they get a tip. The tip leads them to a family. They get the DNA from the family, right? What I think happens is they get a DNA from the person that gives them the tip. They then dig up the baby again, which is about 20 years later, get the DNA from the baby, compare the two DNAs, and they now have a match. So they know it's from this family. They then find out that that there's a child gone missing, and it was not reported as missing. They then know that's such suspicious activity. They then know that the family must know something about the death. They know then that it's a murder. So they reasonably assume it's a murder. They then put some weight on the family, as the homicide detectives have been known to do, and they give him the name of a cousin who's a dishwasher someplace. They wait for him when he leaves work. They confront him, and he confesses. He says that he had sexually abused the child, smothered her, and gets the child's sister to help him dispose of the body. So then they arrest him for murder, and I'm sure he'll spend the rest of his life in jail. And he'll do, and the time he does will be awful. They'll have to segregate him from the other prisoners. The little baby is. To tell you one thing, to give you an idea how interested the cops were in this case, when they buried her, they had a memorial. Nobody knew who she was, but still hundreds of people came. And the speaker was a detective, one of the detectives on the case.
The NYPD, this is, as I understand it, a whole lot of work by people who are paid money to solve crimes today. There's very little reason to believe you'll ever be successful. It's 22 years later. And as I understand, they would visit the grave, and they would always go on the anniversary of discovering the baby and start asking questions in neighborhoods. They had a general idea where she might come from. This is a Mexican family, Juarez, but they didn't know her name. So every year they'd go on that date. Is that something you've heard of before, Eddie, that they just keep pursuing things?
Why? Sometimes the person will go, sometimes if it's a family member, somebody knows it, will go back to essentially the scene of the crime. So that's one of the things that people that commit these kinds of crimes are usually fairly twisted mentally and emotionally, and sometimes they do go back to the scene. Also, a lot of them keep souvenirs. Serial killers often keep souvenirs. This guy was not a serial killer. He was just sexually deviant.
Eddie, the tools that we have now to find these killers, how much has it evolved over the last years or decades?
We didn't have DNA when I was a prosecutor in homicide, and now, of course, they have it, and they're getting better and better at getting it. They're much faster by comparing DNA tests. It's just everything is better, and the ability to examine the skeletons and the dead bodies and get information is much better. The forensic science is enormously improved. And the police department, remember, we have a huge police department. It's got a great history. It's got a great tradition. It's the most successful police department of any major city in the country. And they know what they're doing, and they have. It's also largely populated by men and women whose families have been in policing, sometimes for as much as 100 years. I had a client. It was a great detective, and his family had been policemen ever since they came off from the boat from Ireland in the mid-19th century. That's for 100 years.
I want to especially mention, Eddie, that this was all done in Spanish language. This family is chiefly Spanish language speaking.
Well, you know, a lot of the Hispanics, if there's been one major development in the police department on an ethnic basis, it's the huge contribution that Hispanics have made. They just have, a lot of them have become policemen. They've done a great job as policemen, and they've really changed the relationship of the police department with the community. Although I will say that if you get a 24-year-old Dominican or a Puerto Rican cop, he's still a little hot-blooded, and you got to keep an eye on him when he deals with bad people, because he can get annoyed quickly.
This is a good way for Kelly to go out, Eddie, to solve this case.
Well, wonderful way. A major kudos for the police department.
Ed Hayes, attorney in Manhattan. Baby Hope, Angelica's her name. She's Angelica, and she'll have her gravestone changed accordingly. The crime is solved after 22 years. 22 years. 22 years and some months. Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. It's just like Naked City, Mary. Remember that TV show I sent you to? There are 8 million city stories in the Naked City. This has been one of them. I'm John Batchelor.